He built a billion-dollar company from a garage. On his 60th birthday, sitting in a wheelchair he never asked for, not one employee, not one so-called friend, walked through that door. Then a stranger's son knocked, and what he carried changed everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Voss was the kind of man magazines loved to photograph. Self-made, sharp-eyed, and ruthless in boardrooms where lesser men folded. He started with nothing but a rented garage in Ohio and a used soldering iron, and inside 20 years he had built one of the most talked-about tech companies in the country. People who worked for him called him a genius. People who competed against him called him something else. But everyone, without exception, called him untouchable. That word would come back to haunt every single person who ever said it, because untouchable men fall the hardest, and they fall alone. Richard Voss hadn't started with connections or capital. He started with a mentor named Walter Briggs, an aging electronics repairman who let a 22-year-old Richard sleep on a cot in the back of his shop in exchange for sweeping floors and learning circuitry. Walter used to tell him that any fool could build something when times were good, but the real test of a man was who stayed close when the lights went out. Richard laughed it off back then, young and hungry and certain nothing could ever touch him. He would remember those words differently, decades later, sitting alone in a wheelchair in a mansion built from the very success Walter had helped him find, wondering where every single person who once claimed to love that success had gone. The accident happened on a Tuesday in late autumn, on a stretch of highway Richard had driven 1,000 times without thinking twice. Investigators never fully agreed on what caused it. Some said black ice. Some said a mechanical failure in the very car his own company had proudly sponsored. What they did agree on was the outcome. Richard Voss survived. His legs did not. He woke up in a hospital room surrounded by flowers from people who had already, quietly, begun writing him out of their plans. Within a year, the phone calls slowed. Within 2, they stopped almost entirely. The man who once filled stadiums with applause could not fill a birthday guest list. During his first months of rehabilitation, one visitor came more than any other. A longtime friend and early business partner named Gary Holt, a man Richard had once called a brother. Gary visited twice a week, brought coffee, cracked jokes about physical therapy, and promised Richard nothing had changed between them. Then, almost overnight, the visits stopped. Richard later learned, through a passing comment from a nurse, that Gary had accepted a competing offer to consult for a rival firm the same month Richard's recovery timeline became public knowledge. Nobody announced the betrayal outright. Gary simply vanished from Richard's life the way smoke leaves a room, quietly, completely, and without ever admitting he had been there causing harm in the first place. What made it worse was how invisible the change was to the outside world. On paper, nothing looked wrong. His name stayed on the building, his photo stayed on the website, the board still used his story in investor decks, the scrappy garage founder who beat every odd. But behind those closed conference room doors, something had shifted, something no press release would ever admit. Meetings that once required his signature suddenly did not. Decisions that once needed his blessing were made and finalized before he even heard about them. He was becoming a name people invoked, not a man people consulted, and almost nobody around him seemed willing to say that plainly out loud. His assistant of 11 years, a soft-spoken woman named Diane, was one of the last people who still treated him the way she always had. She brought his coffee the same way, black, no sugar, exactly at 8:15. She still asked about his weekends like they mattered. But even Diane had started noticing the small cruelties nobody bothered to hide anymore. Meetings scheduled in rooms his wheelchair could not easily reach. Memos circulated to everyone except him. A birthday planning email sent to 200 names that somehow excluded the one name it was supposed to honor. She kept a printed copy of that email in her drawer for almost 3 weeks before she found the courage to show anyone. By then, it was almost too late to matter. 200 invitations went out for Richard Voss's 60th birthday. 200 replies came back with warm, polished excuses. Prior commitments, family obligations, sudden travel. The kind of excuses people write when they have already decided the real answer is no, but don't want it written down anywhere that could ever be traced back to them. The caterers still arrived. The cake still got made, 3 tiers, his favorite, lemon with white chocolate shavings. The chairs still got set up in perfect rows facing an empty stage. Everything about that evening looked exactly like a celebration should look, except for the one detail that mattered most. Nobody was coming, and somewhere in that mansion, a man in a wheelchair was starting to understand it, before anyone had the nerve to tell him. Across town, in a modest two-bedroom apartment that smelled like instant coffee and unpaid bills. A single father named Ray Coleman was having a very different kind of night. Ray had been a warehouse supervisor for 9 years before a round of layoffs cut him loose, with a severance check that barely covered 2 months of rent. He was raising his 8-year-old son Caleb, alone, ever since his wife passed 3 years earlier, after a long illness that drained their savings faster than Ray could rebuild them. Ray was proud, tired, and quietly running out of options. The kind of man who smiled through grocery store small talk while doing silent math about which bills could wait another week. The severance money hadn't lasted as long as Ray hoped. Rent came first, then Caleb's school supplies, then the electric bill that arrived twice as high as expected during a brutal stretch of summer heat. Ray had started picking up night shifts at a delivery warehouse 2 towns over, coming home well past midnight and rising again by 6 to get Caleb ready for school, running on coffee and stubborn pride. He never let Caleb see the calculator app open on his phone at the kitchen table, never let him hear the phone calls to the electric company asking, politely, desperately, for 1 more week. Caleb only knew his father as steady and calm, never once suspecting how close steady and calm truly were to breaking. Caleb had a school project that week, a simple assignment about kindness in the community, and out of nowhere, he asked his father to help him make a card for someone he called the sad rich man on TV. Ray had barely paid attention when the local news ran a short segment on Richard Voss's accident months earlier. But Caleb, in the way only children can, had latched onto the image of a powerful man sitting alone in a wheelchair, and it had bothered him ever since. Ray tried to explain that men like that didn't need cards from strangers. Caleb didn't accept that answer. He wanted to make it anyway, and something about his son's stubborn insistence stirred a memory in Ray he hadn't let himself think about in years. That night, while looking for construction paper in the hallway closet, Ray pulled down an old shoebox that had belonged to his late wife, one he hadn't touched since her funeral. Inside were photographs, ticket stubs, and folded letters he had never read all the way through. Near the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band gone brittle with age, was an envelope with a name on it that made Ray's hands go still. It wasn't addressed to him. It wasn't addressed to Caleb. It was addressed, in handwriting Ray didn't recognize, directly to Richard Voss, dated years before Ray had even met his wife, and sealed shut like it had been waiting this entire time for someone to finally open that door. Ray sat on the edge of his bed for nearly an hour before he worked up the nerve to open that envelope. When he finally did, the letter inside was short, only a few lines, but every word rearranged something inside his chest. It was written by his late wife, Ellen, years before she and Ray had even met, back when she worked as a young nurse at a small clinic outside the city. In it, she thanked Richard Voss for something Ray had never once heard her mention in 12 years of marriage, a private act of generosity that had quietly saved her family from losing their home when she was barely 20 years old. Ray read it twice, then a third time, trying to understand why the woman he loved had carried this secret to her grave without ever saying a word. The next morning, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just Caleb's school assignment. Something had pulled him toward that letter the same week his son had begged him to make a card for a stranger neither of them had ever met, and Ray wasn't the kind of man who believed timing like that was an accident. He told himself he was only going to the Voss estate to deliver Caleb's card and satisfy his son's stubborn heart. He didn't tell Caleb about the letter folded in his jacket pocket. He didn't fully admit it to himself either, but some part of him already knew he wasn't leaving that mansion without answers. The Voss estate sat behind iron gates on a hill overlooking the city, the kind of house Ray had only ever seen in magazines at the dentist's office. Security waved him through after Caleb, still clutching his handmade card, insisted through the intercom that it was important in the serious, unshakable way only an 8-year-old can manage. Diane met them at the door, still in her work clothes from a party she'd spent all week helping plan, and now had no guests left to greet. She looked at the two of them, a tired father and a small boy holding a construction paper card, and something in her face softened in a way it hadn't in weeks. Diane tried, gently, to explain that this wasn't a good night for visitors, that Mr. Voss wasn't seeing anyone, that perhaps they should come back another time when things were different. But Caleb, undeterred, simply held the card higher and asked if he could just leave it for the sad man on TV, so he wouldn't feel so alone on his birthday. Diane's composure, carefully held together all evening for the sake of a party nobody attended, finally cracked. She excused herself for a moment, walked back through those long hallways alone, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry somewhere Richard wouldn't see her doing it. Walking through that mansion, Ray couldn't shake the strange, hollow feeling of the place. Hallways built for crowds that no longer came, a dining room set for a party that had already quietly ended before it began. Caleb, oblivious to the weight of it, admired the paintings and the tall windows, tugging his father's sleeve to point out anything that caught his eye. Ray kept one hand in his jacket pocket the entire walk, fingers resting against the folded edge of Ellen's letter. Uncertain if he would even have the nerve to bring it up tonight. Uncertain if some secrets were better left exactly where his late wife had chosen to leave them, sealed and silent, for reasons Ray was only beginning to understand. When Diane returned, she didn't send Ray and Caleb away. Instead, she led them quietly through the mansion, past the untouched three-tier cake, past 200 empty chairs still arranged in perfect rows, toward a private study where Richard Voss sat alone by a window, staring out at nothing in particular. He didn't turn around right away when they entered. He'd grown used to footsteps that belonged to caterers, cleaners, or Diane, never to guests, and certainly never to a child. When Caleb walked straight up to his wheelchair without hesitation and held out the card, Richard finally turned, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone was looking at him like he mattered, instead of like he was already gone. Caleb's card was simple, a crayon drawing of a birthday cake with too many candles and a handwritten message that read, "Happy birthday to the bravest man on TV, from Caleb." Richard read it twice, his jaw tightening in the specific way of a man trying very hard not to let strangers see him break. Ray stood a few steps behind his son, unsure of what to say, until something in Richard's expression shifted from politeness into something closer to recognition. He asked, almost cautiously, what Ray's last name was. When Ray answered, Richard's hand, resting on the arm of his wheelchair, went completely still, and the room fell into a silence none of them expected. Richard asked carefully if Ray's wife's name had been Ellen. Ray's stomach dropped. He asked how a man he had never met in his life could possibly know that. Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked Diane to bring him a small locked drawer from his desk, one nobody but him had opened in over 15 years. Inside was a single photograph of a young nurse named Ellen, and a copy of a letter that matched, word for word, the one folded in Ray's jacket pocket at that very moment. Richard explained, voice unsteady, that decades earlier, before the company, before the fame, he had quietly paid off a stranger's medical debt through a program he never let carry his name, a stranger who turned out to be Ray's future wife. Before either man could fully process what that meant, headlights swept across the driveway outside, and Diane's phone buzzed with a security alert she clearly wasn't expecting. Someone else had arrived at the estate that night, someone who hadn't been invited, someone whose name made Diane's expression change instantly from confusion to quiet dread. She looked at Richard and said only one name, Sylvia Okafor, a former executive Richard had trusted more than almost anyone on his original board, the same person who had been the very first to stop returning his calls after the accident. Nobody in that room understood yet why she would show up tonight, uninvited, on the one evening she had made absolutely certain to stay far away from. Sylvia walked into that study like she still owned a piece of it, dressed like she was attending a board meeting rather than a birthday nobody came to. She didn't acknowledge Ray or Caleb at first, her eyes fixed entirely on Richard, sharp and calculating in a way that immediately put Diane on edge. She claimed she'd come to check on an old friend, but her tone carried none of the warmth those words were supposed to hold. Richard, still gripping Ellen's photograph in one hand, asked her plainly why now, after 18 months of silence, she had chosen tonight of all nights to walk back through his door, uninvited and unannounced. And Sylvia's explanation started smooth, rehearsed, the kind of story crafted by someone used to controlling a room. But small inconsistencies began slipping through. Details about board votes, about a rumor she claimed she'd only heard secondhand, about Richard being finished, unfit, a liability the company could no longer publicly stand behind. Diane, who had quietly kept records nobody asked her to keep, mentioned an email thread Sylvia clearly hadn't expected anyone outside the boardroom to have seen. The temperature in that study changed instantly. Sylvia's practiced calm slipped for just a moment, long enough for everyone present to understand this visit was never about checking on an old friend at all. Richard asked Diane, directly and without hesitation, to read that email thread aloud in front of everyone standing in the room. Diane's voice shook slightly as she read messages Sylvia had sent to board members 18 months earlier, describing Richard as too damaged, too unreliable, too costly to keep as the public face of the company he had built from nothing. It was Sylvia, not the accident, not his wheelchair, who had quietly convinced the board and the wider circle around Richard to slowly withdraw, one relationship at a time, until 200 invitations came back with 200 polite, hollow excuses. Sylvia didn't deny it. She simply said she'd done what was necessary to protect the company's image and its future. Before Richard reached his decision, Diane's phone rang once more. A board member named Harold Whitfield calling to warn Richard, quietly and nervously, that Sylvia had spent the past several months building support to have Richard formally removed from any remaining ceremonial role in the company by year's end. Harold admitted he'd stayed silent out of fear of losing his own position, a confession that landed heavier in that room than almost anything Sylvia herself had said all night. Richard listened without interrupting, absorbing just how far the isolation had spread beyond one person's ambition, understanding now that an entire quiet campaign had been built around the assumption that a man in a wheelchair would never notice and would never fight back. Richard sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the fact that the isolation he'd endured for a year and a half hadn't happened naturally. It had been engineered, carefully, by someone he once trusted enough to name a successor. He looked at Ray, still standing quietly beside his son, a man who owed him nothing, who had walked into that mansion only because an 8-year-old refused to let a stranger spend his birthday completely alone. Richard looked at Caleb's card still resting in his lap, then back at Sylvia, and said, calmly but firmly, that the company's next chapter would not include people who mistook loyalty for something they could switch on and off depending on convenience. Within the week, Richard Voss made 2 decisions that stunned everyone who eventually heard about them. The first was formally removing Sylvia and 2 other board members from any future role in the company he had built, citing conduct that had nothing to do with his physical condition and everything to do with character. The second decision surprised people even more. Richard established a private foundation in Ellen Coleman's name, designed to quietly cover medical debt for struggling families, the same way an anonymous program once helped her decades earlier, and he named Ray as the foundation's first director, with Caleb years later always joking that he got the job before his father did. News of the board's restructuring spread through the company within days, employees whispering in break rooms about the sudden departures nobody had explained publicly. Diane later told Richard that longtime staff members, people who had quietly disagreed with how he'd been treated but felt powerless to say so, began approaching her with quiet relief, some even with apologies they hadn't known how to offer sooner. Richard didn't hold it against them the way he once might have. He understood now, better than most men ever get the chance to understand, how easily silence spreads when people are simply afraid of standing alone, and how rare it truly is when someone chooses to stand there anyway. On what would have been the 1-year anniversary of that lonely, empty birthday, Richard Voss held another small gathering. Nothing like the 200-person event nobody attended. This time there were only a handful of chairs, filled entirely by people who had shown up simply because they wanted to. Diane sat beside him. Ray and Caleb sat across from him. There was a small cake, lemon with white chocolate shavings, cut into pieces small enough for everyone in that room, and for the first time since the accident that took his legs but not, as it turned out, his ability to be truly seen, Richard Voss blew out his candles surrounded by people who had nothing to gain by being there, and everything, somehow, to give. Years later, Caleb would tell people the story of the crayon card he made for a stranger, though by then, Richard Voss was no stranger to him at all. Caleb went on to study business, and it surprised absolutely no one who knew the family when he eventually took an internship at the very foundation his father once led, the one carrying his late mother's name. Richard never fully regained the use of his legs, but he often said, in later interviews he finally agreed to give, that losing them had cost him people he thought were permanent and given him, unexpectedly, a family that never once needed asking twice.